So, chapter 2 gets into, this is not the title of the chapter, this is just my paraphrase of themes, gets into the grounds of ethics and some theories of ethics. So what do we mean by ground? I mean, the phrase simply means, okay, here's one person's perspective, here's another person's perspective, right? Which one is right? Well, if they're floating all over the place, you can't tell. So you have to ground them on something common, and then you can begin to assess them, right? I mean, cheesy, but oftentimes we use these words and it's really not clear what we mean. So when it comes to ethics, when we're talking about grounds of ethics, what we mean is larger, universal principles that we can use to make distinctions, right? And the word principle, princeps in Latin, means first. So all it is like, let's say, as an example, right? Here's a river, right? And there's a farmer down here, delineated by this rake. And there's a guy up here who owns a factory, right? And so the river, the factory owner has pollutants that need to come out, and he puts it in the river, down they go. And then the farmer's like, nope, you can't be doing that because it's hurting my crops, right? So we have position A and we have position B. Now, would you agree that we do have a right, this guy here does have a right to do something with his pollution, right? And we have to understand, in a community, we're all part of it. It's easy for us as consumers, as I sit here in my living room office, to point the ugly stick, at all these, companies. But I'm writing to you on an Apple computer, right? And I've got an iPhone. I've got electricity. I've got air conditioning. In other words, I've used this guy right here. We all have used this guy right here. When it comes to a lot of products, we think like, oh, we've got all this, technology. We don't need, so much pollution, because right now it's all in other countries, right? The factories that produce the actual MacBooks and iPads and iPhones are in places like China. So we don't see the damage that is done environmentally, but it's still there. All that is simply to say that we have to take position B seriously. And obviously position A, right? If the irrigation water is contaminated, well, then we've got a problem. But here's the deal. Which one is right, A or B? We could all take a vote, hands up, and we could all jump up and down and argue and yell at each other one way or the other. But before we can decide as to which one is better, in the same way we have to, which weighs more? Does this weigh more? Or does this weigh more? Right? Well, the only way you'll do it is to have a scale, right? That's supposed to be a scale. Okay, that's a really bad scale. But you have a balance, right? So in other words, without some scale, without some norm, right, which is basically a ruler, without a ground, we have no way to distinguish between A and B, right? Because until we have a common, larger, universal principle that we can make distinctions, so we say, what's our main principle that we're after here? If we're going to say that the health of the food sources outweighs the health of economic profits, then that's going to be our principle. And then we say, you're out of luck, bro, because our principle allowed us to make a distinction, and now we can say that A is a better policy than B. But until we have that, then we don't have any ground, and therefore anything that we try to say in terms of, choosing among positions will only be arbitrary. And as long as everything is just arbitrary and based on people's opinions, then we're in the world of anarchy. Now, all that to say that this chapter gets into some theories, right? And the main ones that it talks about are, where's my notes? Right here. They're called rational theories. He calls them all rational. And they are utilitarianism, I'm just going to go util, okay? But you know what it means, utilitarianism. Then contractualism, I'm going to go contract. And deontology, deontos. And then lastly, discourse. Okay, so utilitarianism, now why is it rational? Well, because imagine, if you will, the soul divided into three parts: reason, emotion, appetite. This comes from Aristotle. Well, actually, Aristotle's is a 5-part. Technically, this is Socrates, but so the rational part of the soul. So human beings have an appetitive soul, an emotional soul, and a rational soul. Part of the soul. The idea is that all things living have at least appetite. So imagine a plant. A plant is a living thing, and a plant's soul, so to speak, because to the Greeks, anything that was alive had a soul. Soul it means like life force, not necessarily the thing that goes on after death, just life force in general. Therefore, all plants and animals and people have souls to the Greeks. So the lowest level of soul is the appetitive soul. I should write that, appetite. In that all things have at least appetite. Some things have an emotional aspect, and these are what we call animals. And we're talking about sentience, emotion, whatever. And what that means essentially is a central nervous system. So the difference between a plant and animal, and literally the word animal comes from the Latin animus, which means, literally it means breath of life, but it means the ability to move, hence animation, right? And so the difference between a plant and an animal is that a animal can walk around, a plant can't, right? And then finally, there is what we call the rational soul. And that is about reason, logic, self-awareness, that kind of thing. And this is particularly human. Only human beings have access to this soul. Anyway, the point of this lies in this deal when your author says rational theories, because remember when we were talking back about in chapter 1 about meta ethics? So it's like there's different places that you could conceivably put these theories and different types of theories. So ones that are about the body or about pleasure, you could actually put utilitarianism here. You could argue, because what Bentham and Mill say is that specifically Bentham said it's about pleasure, right? How to magnify pleasure, sort of. But so anyone that would argue that good in ethics is about physical things, just staying alive, for instance, would be inclined to put rational theory or put their ethical theories here in physical theories. Emotions or sentiments, sentimentalism would include things like appeals to your conscience, that kind of stuff, or intuition, right? Or it just feels correct, right? We feel sometimes guilt or shame or something. So some people then would say that, our ethical theory should have an emotional side, or should emanate from emotions that make us human. And then obviously, if we're going to be talking about the rational, that comes from this part of the soul. The idea being that because we are rational, then that's what makes us unique. Therefore, we should make decisions that are particularly human, which would mean that decisions made about your body and about pleasure, you make them, but they're not particularly human. You have a body and you need pleasure, but letting that part of you decide is not rational, therefore it's not human. Likewise, if we make decisions, emotionally, if we're angry or something, then again, according to this theory of Socrates, then again, we're not really making human decisions, we're making animal decisions. It's only when we make rational choices that we are making human ones. That's why I'm going to skip ahead here. Kant with the categorical imperative. That's why he was so adamant about making sure that ethics is always about universal reason, right? Because if it's not about universal reason, then we run the risk of making bad decisions that are not human decisions, right? Like my dogs, you probably heard them barking a second ago. They don't sit there and think, oh my gosh, he's making a video, so we should not bother him. No, they're nothing but instinct, right? I don't know, a truck drove by or something out there, and they bark it up because that's their whole shtick. But to Kant, the idea is we will, by emotion, because we are selfish in terms of appetites and emotion, we love ourselves very much. We love ourselves more than others. Therefore, we'll always bend the rules for ourselves. That's Kant's shtick. So you ever notice, like, when you're, we all do this sometimes. You're on the phone driving, right? You're texting while driving. I know you shouldn't, but if someone else does it in front of you, you're like, why you? But then when you do it, it's like, well, it'll be okay just this once. We always find ways to bend the rules for ourselves. Hence, we say things like, well, I need to justify my action. The IFY means to make, right? So in other words, I've already decided that what I'm doing is just because, well, maybe I didn't even decide. I just know I want to. Therefore, after the fact, I'm going to go and make it just, right? We have a tendency to do that. But if we're completely rational, here's the theory behind it, right? In this deontology stuff, just like math, right? 2 and 2 is 4. It doesn't matter if you don't like 4. It doesn't matter if, 4 owes you money. 2 and 2 is always 4. Without emotion, without appetite. Hence, the categorical imperative functions like this. First, you get your maxim. A maxim simply is a statement of your ethical an ethical possibility, an ethical statement. We'll just put it that way. But you're not 100% sure if it is correct or not, if it's actually ethical. But it's a statement, a should statement. And then 2, you subject it to the categorical imperative. So here's an example of a maxim. And Kant talks about suicide. He says, suppose that you're in a position where life is really terrible and you want to kill yourself. Okay? So if you're thinking along those lines, your maxim is basically this: when life sucks, I should kill myself. Okay? Good enough. Now, at this point, this is a maxim, but we don't actually know if it is ethical or not. Because in order for something to be ethical, it has to be 100% universally rational. And as soon as we start talking about life sucking, and killing myself, you might think that we're in the world of emotion. And indeed we are. So to make sure that we're out of the world of emotion, right, we're going to do this little number, right? So here we are. I want to kill myself, but I need to make sure that it makes sense in reason. So how do we bring it up to reason? Invoke the categorical imperative. So what do? I act only on that maxim which I could wish to be a universal law. So could it be that this phrase, when life sucks, I should kill myself, is true 100% of the time? In other words, could it be a universal law? So in other words, anytime any one of us, our lives sucked, we kill ourselves. Then you'd understand that this maxim, if it actually became a universal law, it would contradict itself because no one would be around. There would be no life, human life. Make sense? Therefore, it's totally irrational. Therefore, this statement, when life sucks, I should kill myself, is unethical. Why? Because it can't stand up to universal statement. In other words, categorical imperative. And all the categorical imperative means is categorical, just means undeniable. It means unchanging. Never changes. And an imperative means a law. So an unchanging law. And where's the only place in human experience where we find unchanging laws? Math, right? In other words, pure reason. Now, utilitarianism. So the idea behind that is guys like Bentham and Mill. I'm not going to go into it. The chapter was there. You can, check it out, obviously. I'm just explaining things a little bit. So in utilitarianism, the idea is that we should maximize pleasure. And the thing here is, because what Mill is after is Mill's writing in the 1800s. And so he has seen empires come and go. He's seen the medieval Catholic Church come and go. He's seen many ethical systems and political systems fall apart. And so one thing that he has learned is that the only thing that you can be certain that people will follow is their bodily pleasures and appetites. Therefore, the ground, right, here we go, the ground of what is good and bad is not reason. Because unlike Kant, Mill's idea is people won't do what's rational. It's just like my son. I tell him, hey, here's the rule you have to follow. And I give him an explanation, right? My son's 12. I'm like, here, you need to do this, and here's why. And he understands, but he doesn't comply, right? So the only way to force him to do something is not with more rational arguments, but rather take something away from him, minimize his pleasure, right? And that's what'll make him do it, right? It's about pain and pleasure, not about rational arguments. And so Mill is aware of this. Well, Bentham was the first guy, right, as you read about in the chapter. But Mill wrote an apologetic afterwards, and it's actually Mill's account of utilitarianism that really most people refer to. But the point of the matter is, his idea is the ground for deciding good and bad, what brings the most pleasure, but here's the thing, to the community. Right? So his shtick was the greatest happiness principle. So what decision between A and B, right? Which one brings the community the greatest amount of happiness or pleasure? But he defines happiness as pleasure. Now, you can see how that could lead to a sense of hedonism, right? Hedonism is the idea that we care only about physical pleasure. However, what Mill says is when it comes to pleasure, there is a distinction between quality of pleasure and quantity of pleasure. Now, your chapter didn't get so heavy into this, but it's important, I think, to fully appreciate Mill on this regard. Because he says what quality pleasures, what they really are things that engage what he calls the higher faculties. In other words, reason, higher culture, literature, philosophy, science, that kind of stuff. His point is that, going back to this concept of human nature, he really does believe we still, at the end of the day, are rational. Yeah, we have these compulsions sometimes, based on our emotions and appetites that push us away. But he believed that with education, you could make most people understand that real pleasure includes the higher faculties. So in other words, reading a Shakespeare play, which is engaging of your, higher faculties, is philosophical in nature, there's reason in there, that kind of thing, is actually more pleasurable than, like a Pulp Fiction novel, or even like Stephen King. I'm not knocking Stephen King. He's a great writer. But Stephen King books and movies are about pleasure and thrill of the moment, right? It's not necessarily about, human nature and philosophical stuff as you would find in like Hamlet, right? So that's Mill's thing. But still, to Mill, it's about the greatest pleasure. So the ground is greatest happiness for the greatest many. That's the distinction. As opposed to Kant, who is saying that, whatever is rationally universal. Contract theory is going to argue that what is good is what is good for the community, ultimately. And that our governments, right, are a way of, governing our lower passions. And here's sort of the deal there, is that, so Hobbes, that you'll read about in there, he's our guy from chapter 2, says that without government, human beings, because we have a sense of equality, right? At the end of the day, we're all kind of equal in the fact that there's generally not naturally better people in the human race, right? You know how like gorillas, they have a natural leader, the silverback, who's the biggest guy, right? Human beings don't have that, which leads to problems because we all assume that we are equal. And therefore, we'll fight over things because we don't wait our turn. In animal packs, the lesser, members of the pack wait their turn, so it's actually far more peaceful. Not with us. So because, this is Hobbesy, let me get a different color. Because we are, as he says, ruled by our passions, in other words, our appetites and emotions, we need to be governed. The idea is that reason should govern our own selves, right? However, some people are not rational enough, therefore they need a strong king to enforce rules that govern them. And when the king governs us, then we are able to control our lower passions, and so that we can enjoy a commonwealth. In other words, we will all be left to our own devices to pursue happiness in whatever way we see fit without engaging in war among each other. In other words, by having a strong, king, government that keeps us from basically committing crimes, stealing from each other, killing each other, taking each other's stuff, right? In other words, we leave ourselves alone, then we can function as a society. So I give you some freedom to do your thing, and I won't mess with you. You do the same to me. We keep our passions governed, and now we can have a decent society. But that takes, he argues politically, that takes a strong king. But if only the king could be within our own souls, then we would govern ourselves. And then finally, the chapter gets into discourse. And the idea there is that you got to look at each case. It's case by case. And this is kind of like a postmodern idea almost. And the idea is this, that you got to be careful about trying to say what is and what is not good. At the end of the day, what postmodernism does is it says that there are no grounds. Oh no, what just happened? I didn't mean to do that. Okay, here. There are no grounds because here's the deal. All our, oh man, can I push this back up? No. Oh wait, there we go. Ha, we're back. That was weird. So the idea is that any of our, all of our moral, anything to say about truth, all truths are ultimately about language, right? Because you have to speak said truth, right? And language is always political, right? So in other words, are we going to call, okay, here's a fetus, right? We can call a fetus an unborn baby. Or we can call a fetus fetus, right? What I was thinking anyway, you get the point. Whichever word you use obviously has a tremendous, effect and brings with it a whole ideology, doesn't it? Right? And so, what's another good example? Illegal alien versus undocumented, right? They kind of mean the same thing. but totally different ideologies, right? And so what happens with this discourse theory and postmodernism is the recognition that all of these things are political, right? So all there is there's what's called a dominant narrative, and that whatever kind of social class sort of has the stage at any given point in its history, they're the ones who decide what is right, what is wrong, what words we'll use, etc. Therefore, there's always this discourse with the idea being that there isn't an overarching ground necessarily. We need to constantly be communicating, and through communicating and discourse, free discourse, mind you, not one, lorded over by sort of a hegemonic ideology or a dominant narrative that suits one class over another. When we have true free discourse, it's in discussion, it's in dialogue that we get our sense of should and should not. So in other words, it's like making sure that we don't just stick to like hollow words that have, come not to have gotten to the point where they don't serve us anymore. So that's what we mean by that. Anyways, that's essentially what chapter 2 is all about. I hope this kind of helps by way of understanding, bigger picture.